This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is Mastermind Episode 12, featuring retired four-star General Stan McChrystal, New York Times best-selling author, as well as CEO and chairman of the McChrystal Group. Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vassalopoulos, founder of Rafty Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Jan Rutherford, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us a part of your day as we study leaders. And as Jim said, this is Mastermind Episode 12. That means it's a special episode. We've also got almost 480 other episodes in our catalog, so we're getting really close to 500. We're really proud of that. And you can find all our past episodes, which are all evergreen, by the way, at theleadershippodcast.com.
But this episode is a very special episode, and it's sponsored and brought to you by Darley. Darley's mission supports all our military and first responders with the equipment they need to ensure mission success, whether it's a water pump, a drone, or emergency medical supplies. Learn more about this fantastic company and the people supporting our nation's heroes at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
To our audience, today on the Leadership Podcast, we're honored to welcome General Stanley McChrystal. And this will be a little bit longer bio than normal because I've realized that not everybody knows who General McChrystal is. And I want you to know why he's such an important guest and a little bit about his background before we get into this. His name, General McChrystal, is a leader whose name is synonymous with adaptability, discipline, and service. A four-star general, former commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan, and the architect of the JSOC, or Joint Special Operations Command. General McChrystal redefined how complex, decentralized teams operate under pressure. Since retiring from the military, he has brought the same clarity and conviction to the world of leadership development, advising CEOs, teaching at Yale, and writing bestsellers like Team of Teams, Leaders, Myth and Reality, and Risk, a User's Guide. His most recent work on character challenges us leaders to look beyond competence and charisma to the moral foundation that earns lasting trust. General McChrystal leads with humility, teaches with candor, and reminds us that leadership is never about the leader. It's about the mission, the people, and the values we refuse to compromise. Welcome, Stan. We're glad to have you back on the program, and we're grateful to welcome you back for a third time to the Leadership Podcast.
Well, Jan, Jim, it's a special honor to be back with y'all.
Well, you were saying that before we hit the record button, this is your last book. You promised Annie. Is that a fact?
I did. It's a fact. I promised Annie, and I intend to live up to that because these were a lot of work. But I will tell you honestly, this was the most fun and satisfying book to work on. Maybe it's just because I'd gone through other experiences. Maybe I'm at this point in life, and maybe it was a chance just to reflect on things that were important to me. But it was particularly fun, and I worked with a guy named Jeff Goins, amazing, and became a thought partner. And he became, I have to write all of this myself, but he pressure tested my thinking, my ideas in a way that I think I really appreciated.
That's great. So I wanted to tell you my favorite line from the whole book. There's a chapter that starts with, "I'm pretty sure I will die." And I just got the biggest chuckle out of that because I just thought it was so understated. And it led into a great discussion that you laid out there. And, I looked at, lots of different parts of the book, and I really loved the subtitles of the major, the three major categories. Character's the only metric that matters. Reaching our conviction demands deep reflection. The most central, most critical discipline is to think for ourselves. And lastly, becoming who we want to be starts with deciding what that is. I mean, you really laid that out in a really compelling and thought-provoking way. And, a lot has been written about your own leadership. And I wanted to rewind a little bit further about where maybe the root of where all this came from. Time as a cadet at West Point. Can you share a moment or a habit from childhood, home, maybe something instilled by mom or dad, or a hindsight that was foundational in shaping that sense of character?
Yeah, I would describe my parents. My father was an Army officer like his father had been. and he was a quiet guy. He wasn't braggadocious. He was an infantryman, a combat infantryman in Korea and Vietnam. But if you ever saw that movie, The Great Santini,
Oh, yeah.
where,
Robert Duvall.
yeah, he played this really almost out of control guy, big personality. My father was the other end of the spectrum,
Wow.
very quiet, very focused. But I always wanted to be him. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be a soldier like him, but I wanted to have the demeanor he had. And my mother was different. She was a Southern girl who'd married an Army officer, not from a military family, but she was very focused, very thoughtful, very values driven, and very interested in reading and literature and those sorts of things. And so I went through a life watching them. And as I described to people, I never once saw them do anything wrong. Now, my mother died when she was 45, so that was 20-some years of marriage, but I was 16 when she died. And in my entire life, I never saw them take change they shouldn't have gotten from a store clerk or take a parking place they shouldn't have taken. Now, they weren't perfect people, but if they weren't, I never saw it. And I think my siblings were the same way. There were 6 kids. And so they never sat us down and talked to us about values and never preached at us. They just lived in a way that you thought, well, that's the right way to go. And I think that had an effect on me through my entire life.
What birth order were you of the 6 kids?
Yeah, I was number 4. So there were a boy and then a girl, then another boy, and then me. I was 4. And then there was a break of 6+ years. And then my mother suddenly had another child, and then she had another to keep that one company. So you sort of had the first 4 who had one life experience, and then the second 2 who had a very different life experience because the family had evolved on and that sort of thing.
Wow. And so I'm just curious. So your mother passed away when you were 16. What changed in your life when that happened, your responsibilities?
Sort of everything. My father was a new brigadier general. He was not too long back from his second tour in Vietnam, had 6 kids, and my mother died suddenly, literally on New Year's Day morning, 1971, and they hadn't gone out New Year's Eve.
Wow.
She got sick, and it was kidney failure, and by that night, she was dead. And so my father, who was extraordinarily reliant emotionally on her, and I didn't really understand that until he came home that morning. All the kids had stayed awake that night because our mother was so sick. He came back the next morning from Walter Reed Hospital, and he was in his uniform, and he had been crying.
Mm.
And it was hard to see this combat infantryman clearly devastated. And so what happened was, to a degree, my mother was the glue that held the family together. And my 2 younger brothers went off to live with my sister for a while. One of my brothers was already in the Army. So the family lost the glue. And for several years, my father went through a really tough period.
Mm.
And he drank he became an alcoholic and ended his career. And then he stopped that. A few years later, met another lady and lived with her for 35 years, a wonderful additional chapter in his life. But I saw what the effect of losing the person that you are so attached to. They were such a special couple, at least, my parents are going to seem that way. But to see how vulnerable here this soldier is suddenly when something emotional like that hits him, and so unexpectedly as well.
Yeah. Hard to be stoic.
I think one of the things that, I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, but one of the things I think is just so on point and fascinating is the statement you made is like, becoming who you want to be starts with deciding what that is. And I just think that is something most people just don't do. They just kind of default into what's going on. At what point did you kind of make that, determination? And did it change or waver, as you went through this experience with your mother and everything else? I mean, how did that get shaped by your siblings, by the condition of the family and everything else through that process?
Yeah, Jim, that's a great question, because I don't know that I was my mother's favorite child, but I was certainly one she connected with a little differently than the others, because the amount I like to read, my age. I was there and around when my father was on particularly a second tour in Vietnam, and therefore she's, doesn't have another adult there. So I think we had a special relationship, and she used to encourage me to do and be certain things. My father told me later that my mother had not really wanted me to go into the Army. She wanted me to do something else, but she never told me that. And what she did talk about occasionally was just doing the right thing, but never in a preachy sort of way, always in just sort of a, obviously, this is what we do. She was very involved in the civil rights movement. She was a great believer in that. Even though she was from the deep South, she just had this, deep feeling about it. And so she imparted some of those values. And then I think all of us, or at least for me, you go through life with a general idea of what you want to be. I wanted to be a soldier. I knew I wanted to be a good person. I wasn't quite sure what that was, because you watch war movies and you see soldiers, and in one movie, the leader is this hard-bitten loner. And then another movie, they take on a different persona. And so most of us, as we develop, I know I did, you try on different personas.
Mm-hmm.
And you try them for a period of time. You try being a real hard ass. You try being, George Patton for a little while. And you figure out none of those are you. At some point, there is a you, and you've got to sort of figure out what that is. I had a wild youth in a free spirit high school era. And then when I went to West Point, I got into a lot of disciplinary problems for my first 2 years because I was very ill-disciplined. I got what they call these slugs, or 4 big punishments. And I came within literally a hair's breadth of being thrown out of the academy my yearling or sophomore year for demerits. I did this final act, which I shouldn't have done, and I got caught. And they had the ability to throw me out based upon how they wrote up the offense. You could write it more serious or less so. And the guy wrote it up less so, which kept me right under. Now, later in life, I could laugh with people about all the trouble I got into West Point. Yet, look, I still became, a 4-star general. I went up to West Point, gave a speech one time, told them I never learned any math up there, and I got in all this trouble. And of course, the cadets love that story. But as I think about it more, I was taking the thing that at that point in my life was the most important thing to me, that opportunity to be a professional soldier, and I put it all at risk. And I put it all at risk, not for good reason, but just because I was ill-disciplined and immature. And fortunately, the powers that be at West Point were more mature than me, and they didn't let me self-destruct. But the story about me getting in trouble wouldn't be funny if I hadn't graduated. We would not be laughing about it now. So I think about that now. It took me quite a while to get a little bit straighter and on the right path.
Well, I have to ask you, Stan, that thing that you almost got thrown out for, it wasn't Naked Man, was it?
No. No.
Okay. Let me dive into that a little more, though. Was, again, when you go back in time a little bit, again, we've all kind of been there, misbehaved, done things. But what about the first, and I was talking to somebody in special ops yesterday about the first moral dilemma that they had. And I had one as a lieutenant that was a doozy. I'm wondering about your first really moral dilemma where maybe you did the right thing, maybe you didn't, but it was something that you knew, you knew black and white, what was right and wrong. Can you go back to something?
Yeah, I go back to one pretty early, actually, in Ranger School. And I'm in Ranger School in the Florida phase, which is, for people to know, it's a 58-day course that wears you out. And then they sort of test your ability to drive through under tough circumstances. So we're in this last phase, and I'm on a 12-day patrol with my comrades there, fellow students, and they kept switching leaders. And so they switched leaders at a point when we had just finished the operational part. We were going into a patrol base, and a new guy was put in charge. And the guy who was put in charge was universally unpopular. In fact, he was a jerk. He'd been a jerk through the whole course. Nobody liked him, wasn't a team player, but suddenly he's in charge. And so he now decides, okay, we're gonna do everything by the book because I'm in charge, because he's being graded. And he comes around and he says, okay, everybody pull security, this. And about 5 of us or 6 of us got together and we said, nope. And we laid out our ponchos and we pulled out poncho liners and we said, we're going to sleep. And he goes, no, you can't do that. You got to pull security because so-and-so. And we basically said, nope, we're going to sleep. Screw you. And in the moment, it was kind of funny. If it had been in combat, of course, we'd have been putting everybody's life at risk, but it wasn't. But I don't even remember if the guy flunked the patrol or passed Ranger School. He probably didn't pass the patrol, probably didn't pass Ranger School. But the point is, we did that theoretically to punish him, but maybe because we were just lazy. And I've always been embarrassed by that because very early in my career, there was a right and wrong there. It was pretty clear.
Yeah.
And we did the wrong thing. And I've never felt good about it since. I don't even remember the guy's name.
Wow.
But I remember my name and I remember doing it.
Yeah, it's funny. This conversation is similar, very similar yesterday, but with somebody it's 42, getting ready to retire from special operations. And we talked about the saying, the hard right versus the easy wrong. And you just described so many incidences where I can think of doing the easy wrong and not the hard right. And was there ever a time that, again, that you weren't, 22 years old, 23 years old, maybe you were 40 years old, where you're like, where you thought, well, I thought this persona was the right one. And I, did.
Yeah, I think, when I was a little older, I was a senior first lieutenant in Special Forces in A Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group. And that was not a great era in Special Forces, late 70s.
Yep.
And it was far enough after Vietnam, there'd been a deterioration, and yet they had started to improve again, which they did later. And I was a team leader, and I was a pretty good team leader, but I was way too familiar with the guys on my team because I sort of thought that was the way to be popular. That was the way. And some of the things we did together, of course, 5 years later in my career, I would have never allowed a lieutenant to do, socializing and things with their guys. But I had a picture of that's what Special Forces officers did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't right. But it all gets back to you try these different things. And if you're lucky, you bounce off the guardrails on either side. And I was lucky really to be able to do that.
Well, I want this interview to be about you, not me, but I will just say one thing. But, I was in Special Forces the same time. And
Exactly.
And there were a lot of people that didn't have a moral compass. And I was a teenager. And luckily, I did find a guy when I went through ROTC later on that had a great moral compass. And he's still a dear friend to this day. And I wonder what stirred in me and recognized that I needed to find that person, to steer me.
And
Go
we're
ahead.
lucky. We're lucky if we run into those special leaders. I was a team commander as a first lieutenant, and I thought I was really good. I thought I was much better than I was. And we were in a company of 6 teams, and then we had a company commander who was a slightly older major with a tremendous amount of combat experience in Vietnam, and kind of a wise old guy, but not real effusive. And so we're in one of these company meetings, and he's saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. And I don't remember exactly how I said it, but I basically said, well, just tell us generally what you want. We'll get it, then stay out of the way. And, if I were him, I'd have smacked me, First Lieutenant McChrystal. But he came over to my team house right after the meeting, and he fired me.
Oh, wow.
He relieved me. And so I'm sitting in the team house going, I've been relieved. I never thought, here I am, golden boy, going to be a great Army officer. I get relieved, and I didn't know what to do. I just literally sat there with my team sergeant for about 2 hours. And then the Major Gray was his name. He came back over and he goes, okay, I've decided relieving you is wrong. That would be too easy on you. You're going to stay here, and I'm going to teach you to be an Army officer. And
Wow.
Most people wouldn't have been as mature as he was to do that.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have. But I was lucky enough to run into people like that who, at the right moment, with the right personality to kind of knock me upside the head.
Yeah, and I wonder if we run into them or if we attract them. That's always what I've wondered. But before we go to Jim's next question, just a reminder, we're speaking with Stan today because of the generosity of Darley being our sponsor, and we're very grateful. They're a great company based in America's Midwest, and they support our first responders and military all around the globe. And you can learn more about them at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com.
It's interesting, Jane, you mentioned like, do we attract people or not? I was having that same conversation with someone yesterday, and it was really about like attracting people who, you know, are kind of, if you got a positive attitude, you attract positive people. You got a negative attitude, you know, you get in these negative cycles and attract negative people. I think it's really special though, Stan, as you kind of suggest, when you maybe don't have the right attitude, but you attract someone with the right attitude to help you.
That's something.
That is just a really special circumstance to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it goes both ways. I know that as I got a little more senior and I could attract people to units I was leading, then they would join because I asked them to or invited them to. And I felt a new responsibility to be better than I would otherwise be because I had made them a value proposition, come here and I will be a good leader and we'll be successful. And so I think they maybe unintentionally had the effect of being really important to keeping me at least trying to be as good a leader as I could be.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. You haven't always had those good leaders for you, though. You've run into some people who were maybe early in your career that, you know, might have been examples of poor character, maybe Damon, Massingale, some names that you're familiar with. Tell us how that helped clarify what kind of leader you wanted to be.
Yeah, that's a great question because when I was a lieutenant in the 82nd, before I went Special Forces, I was in a battalion in the mid to late 70s that had a lot of good talent in it, but we weren't a good battalion because the Army wasn't training very well at that point and for lots of reasons. And we got a battalion commander in who was really unfortunate selection. He had been in another battalion, been hurt in a training accident, and then he'd been in the hospital for some months and he'd recovered and they gave him another shot at a battalion. So he came to ours and he was a negative personality. I mean, he was always referring to people sort of demeaningly, but he was also, I remember we're doing a 25-mile foot march and I'm marching with my platoon and he stops his Jeep next to me and just screams at me for maybe 20 seconds, spitting on me as he does it. I'm not quite sure what he was upset about, but then he got back in his Jeep and, you know, rode away. And I thought, well, he's humiliated me in front of the troops. And I turned to the paratroopers and he hadn't humiliated me, he'd humiliated himself. And that was interesting. But then the most instructive thing was he was always talking about, you know, sort of right, wrong, and this. And on the last day of a quarter where we had recruiting goals or reenlistment goals, and it was hard to get soldiers to reenlist back in the 70s, he lifted a bar to reenlistment that my company commander had imposed on a terrible soldier. Guy should have been in jail, not in the 82nd, but we barred him to reenlistment. The battalion commander at 5 a.m. had a person come down, get this substandard soldier, bring him to battalion headquarters, lift the bar, and re-enlist him without my company commander, first sergeant, even knowing about it. And as soon as I heard this, everything about doing the right thing, just immediately you realize is an absolute falsehood. And so you don't need a lot of examples like that just to put them away and say, I will never, hopefully, never do that kind of thing in my career.
Yeah. What part of you kind of stepped in? I mean, because a lot of times when you're young, you say, well, I just guess that's the way it's done. Maybe I don't understand. You know, you accept things. And you say, maybe I don't understand the world and this is the way it is. What part of you was just like, not on my watch?
Boy, Jen, that's a great question. I think it was probably part of me thinking what my father would do, people I admired, but then I was lucky enough to have some peers too, because you got to bounce stuff off people at that point. And, you know, you kind of look at your peers and you go, wow, that seemed messed up. And they, you know, you're reinforcing each other that way. And of course, if we're lucky enough to have a really good spouse like I did, even though she was young at that point, she could look at something and go, how could that be right? And so you get reinforced. It would be pretty easy in the wrong environment to find yourself slipping in the wrong direction. And I remind that about people. A leader's not an individual rock that everybody comes around. It's a group of people, and you reinforce each other. And so if you hang out with the right people, you're all stronger. And if you hang out with the wrong people, potentially you're all much weaker.
Yeah. Stan, I want to ask you a question I think a lot of people would want me to ask, because I think, your opinion matters. And it's probably a little tricky one, but, there's a lot of public figures out there that are supposed to be examples of character, whether they're politicians, military leaders, business leaders, performers, athletes. But, they're held to a different standard, or they should be. Was there ever a time someone failed that test of character for you, that someone you had first admired and then they failed that? And how did that affect your philosophy and your thinking about facing your own hypocrisy?
Yeah. I think all of us have seen public figures who, you either put on a pedestal or try to emulate, and you find out the backstory about them, whether they're philanderers or whether they're dishonest or numbers of things they do. And it is dispiriting because you say, well, I really kind of want to be like that person. And you find out things that they do that you don't want to be like. But you start to say, well, if they're really good at what they do, is it okay that they do these things that they shouldn't do? And, it takes quite a while I think for many of us to sort of come to grips with that. And I've come to the grips with, no, they shouldn't. It does not, just because I use the Darryl Strawberry rule. People are old enough to remember Darryl Strawberry. Good baseball player, little drug problem. And so do you say they're not a good person, but they're really good at what they do, and therefore I'm going to excuse that? And I've come to the conclusion that that's a bad calculation. Now, people don't have to be perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody's got weaknesses. So don't let me communicate that it's binary. But there are bounds of acceptability. There are things that are just not acceptable to me. And I have certain rules. And if somebody violates those rules, I may not go after them publicly or anything, but I will step away from them if I have a relationship with them. And I will not seek to follow them if, in fact, I'm in that kind of a situation. Yeah. I just think it's really important. And the worst thing is if it's somebody close to you.
Yeah. Do you think as you've gotten older that your standards have actually gotten higher for someone to be your friend? Jim and I often talk about the bare minimum is you got to like, trust, and respect someone. But do you find that, gosh, boy, as a lieutenant, you had a ton of friends, as a colonel, maybe a few less. And, now it's different about kind of going to that quote, the only way you're going to be different 5 years from now is the people you associate with and the books you read.
Yeah, I think that's an experience that I've had. At this point in my life, I have to deal with a lot of people, and I can be friendly with a lot of people, but I actually have a very small number of friends. And I talk about friends as people I have a frequent interaction with, the kinds of things, if they need something from me, I'm absolutely going to drop what I do and do it. You just can't maintain a huge number of friendships. Again, you can have this wider circle of people that you like, but you don't see them very often. The standards, in this, I'll have to answer this correctly. I'm not as judgmental on people in general as I was some years back. But at the same time, that doesn't mean I'll be friends with them. I will say, well, okay, that's the way they are. I don't agree with that. I don't like that, but I'm not going to waste any time denouncing them or thinking about them. I'm just not going to, I choose not to have them in my inner circle because I don't need to at this point in life.
Yeah.
I'm going to have people that I really respect and like because that's who makes me respect myself.
Do you think there's any way is there a shortcut to that, to figuring that out when you're 30 or 35 versus being older? Or do you think that just one of those things that just comes with age and experience?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we could study more. I think that I could have done a lot more reading of philosophy, and not just to be able to quote philosophers, but things that really force you to think. There are a few books like novels that force you to think. I know we probably have all read Once an Eagle by Anton Myrer, and that was sort of a character study of two different kinds of Army officers. But as you read it multiple times through your career, you get a very different impression of each of them. When you're young, there's one who's really good and there's one who's really bad. And by the time you read them, when you're 30 years into your career, the really good one is not quite that great. And the really bad one, you kind of go, well, I understand him. I don't like him, but I understand him. So I think life's like that. You start to understand that life is nuances forever.
Yep.
Yeah. I want to kind of pull that thread a little deeper, and because I'm really interested and I'm really curious about this, and this is not intended to be a gotcha question. I just really honestly I want to get your perspective as someone who's seen so much, and you've got such a reflective position on what you've seen. My wife and I were watching, I don't know, some caught our eye the other day. We ended up watching like 3 hours worth of like colorized history of World War II or something like that. It was really interesting. And, they were talking about this thing called like total war and it was just awful and it looked awful. And, clearly we've gotten to a point where we think we can have antiseptic kind of conflicts and things like that. You've seen a lot, you've done a lot. How has your view on life, war changed through the years? I'm really curious, like, because I think you said something really interesting in another interview we did earlier where you said, I think that, even like some type of national service or some type of, draft where, it would make the vote to go to war a lot harder if people had some skin in the game. You're a guy, I'm a guy who's never really had personally skin in the game. What is your perspective on that as you look back on your career and everything you've seen?
Yeah. I'm going to give several different things and hopefully they'll in some way intersect. The first is, when you're a young soldier, you want to go to war. And maybe not everybody does, but the reality is most people, because you want to have that experience so you are legitimate. Because until you've done the job that you've been trained for, there's some feeling in you that you haven't actually met the contractual agreement. They train you for war, they pay you for these years, and you feel like you got to go do that. Now, that's not a reason to have wars, but that is, they say that soldiers hate war most of all, but that's usually soldiers who've been in one. After you've been in a war, there's conflicting experiences. The first is, it almost never produces the outcome people expect. Now, sometimes you'll have a decisive victory like World War II, but that's become a little bit more antiseptic with the passage of time too. That was a little more complicated. And in the instance, it didn't feel as good as we might think it felt. So I've come to the conclusion that usually wars don't actually solve the problem that we hope that they will. And they produce second and third order effects that are just extraordinarily negative. And so I'm much more leery, but I do understand the need to have the ability and the willingness to go to war because, again, part of the society doesn't agree with that. But I wrote a piece in the book about going to right outside Gaza after October 7th. And I had a lot of friends in the Israeli special operations and intelligence communities. So I went over for a week and toured most of those. And I was there just as the Barak Brigade had come out of their first couple of months in Gaza. And so this entire young generation of soldiers, men and women, had come out and all their armored vehicles were shot to pieces. We were right in the assembly areas. They pulled in and they dropped their ramps and they started cleaning out and they looked scruffy. And they had this demeanor that was very familiar. And the demeanor was people who've come out of combat really for the first time act differently. They act like they think they're supposed to act when they are now combat veterans. It's sort of this intentional nonchalance, casualness. It's hard to describe exactly, but also a camaraderie amongst them. But then the other thing about those young, in this case, Israeli soldiers, they had entered a new place in society because they had grown up on stories of the War of Independence, and then the 56 war, then the 67 war, then the 73 war, all of the things before that. And so particularly that brigade, which had a storied history, they were in the shadow of heroes and heroism and deeds on the battlefield, but none of them had experienced it until this. Now, suddenly they'd experienced it, and they came out, and maybe I'm seeing what I wanted to see, but what I thought I saw is they now felt legitimate. They felt as they had a right to a seat at the table in Israel when the country was going to sit down and decide which way they were going to go in terms of policy and all. They didn't have to be quiet while the old veterans who fought for the nation made decisions. They had the ability to pull their chair up and say, wait a minute, here's what we do. Now, again, that's not a political comment on that war, because this is true, I think, of every war.
Yeah.
There is something about national service, which we talked about, Jim, that this is more dramatic, but when you have contributed to something and maybe sacrificed for something, you feel much more empowered to step up and take your place in deciding where the team, the organization, whatever goes. And I think that dynamic's really important. And I think we shouldn't forget that about war or about any other of those kinds of experiences.
Yeah. Stan, again, Jim and I both loved the book, and a lot of it is speaking to the individual, and, one of the things, that I say to my clients all the time is, you don't need fixing. You're not broke. We're all a work in progress. And as long as you're curious and trying to get better, good on you. But I'm also thinking about the conversations you and I have had about the Service Year Alliance, about the system, the environment. And, and when we think about a corporation, we can say, hey, there's these bad behaviors from people. And then we can say, well, what's wrong with the environment? It's like the analogy I always say, if there's a bad intersection, it's not putting a traffic cop there. It might be creating a roundabout. Your charge to everyone that you've spoken to has been, I want to create a national conversation. We need to talk about character. And so that's up to the individuals. But what has to happen with the system that's going to facilitate the better behaviors? And I'm wondering what your role will be in that.
Yeah. Well, Jed, thanks for asking that question. Not the last part, but the first part.
Yeah.
I think we need a national conversation on character, because I think your description of the problem is exactly right. Let's take our political system, but it applies to many other parts of our society right now. We've let character erode. We've let character, which used to be a required trait, at least superficially, although people behind the scenes weren't always good. There were norms and standards that required people to act with a level of decorum and maturity and responsibility. And because of that, it made everybody a little bit better than they would be. No, it made everybody a lot better. Think about the best military units we were ever a part of. Just being in that unit caused us to be better than we'd be otherwise, because there were standards, expectations, and whatnot, and your peers were doing that, and you wanted to fit in there. What we've done is we've allowed our political environment to erode to the point where even though we take good people, and I think generally the people who go into politics are good people, they go into this almost meat grinder-like process where in many cases they have to become hyper-partisan to survive primaries. They've got to raise a ton of money just to survive, and so that makes you do a tremendous number of unnatural acts to get all that money. They've got to survive the almost toxic environment between players, but then also trying to deal with the media. And so what happens is they become animals of that environment. And you may start with somebody who has great ideals and great talents and whatnot, and after a while they've adapted to thrive in that environment and they become something very different, something very disappointing. And then we're shocked and we say, well, how did all these terrible people get into politics? Well, maybe they weren't terrible. Maybe we've allowed the system to put such pressures that it does that.
Yeah.
My call for a national conversation on character is sort of to tell everybody, stop what you're doing. Most of you are not being the people you even want to be.
Yeah.
You're not the people you think you are. Look in the mirror and do that self-reflection. And then on a national level, why did we stop demanding character from people? Why do we allow politicians to lie to us when we know they're lying and they know we know it? Why do we put up with that?
Yeah.
And so I'm hopeful that the national conversation won't be done by a political leader. It won't be led by pundits. It will start in schools, on teams, in churches. It'll be this groundswell that says, okay, enough. This is ridiculous. We are not going to put up with that anymore. Now, how it goes from there, I'm not sure. I've never been a part of something like this, but I'm hopeful that that's the direction it takes.
And Jim's got to follow up. In the book, you outlined a few things and you said, hey, here's some things I recommend. Not everybody's going to agree with it. And it was, some big things about our system that really has to change. In my experience, trying to get change done in corporations, it does not happen unless there's pain.
Yeah.
I mean, if things are kind of going along, people are making money, they're not going to change. Do you think that there has to be even more pain before we change? Or do you think there's a different sort of catalyst to bring about what we all want?
Jen, I think there has to be more pain. I had that experience in our counterterrorist forces, JSOC, and we could never have done the changes we did when I was there had we not been in a war we were losing. It gave us the impetus for that. I think our political system, there are too many stakeholders with too many incentives to hold on to the status quo. There's going to have to be something which allows the tectonic plates to move. Now, maybe you could get a really effective leader who comes in and can create a move for that. But the problem with leaders is they come in, if they're very, very effective, they become very, very powerful. And then the history of very, very powerful leaders is you get something you don't want. You get an autocrat. And that happens with most personalities. Absolute power, corrupts absolutely. So that's my thinking.
Yeah. Hey, Stan, I'm just kind of curious because, I think our Constitution's a thing of beauty. It really is an amazing thing. And, individuals have rights, but in our constitutional republic, we go with the mass. And I think if I look at, let's say, my near experience of my parents being immigrants, they came over in a big topic of discussion, whether, on both sides of my family that immigrated here was, you got to assimilate. We got to assimilate. We got to, and I think there was it used to be, we lived in this world where all men wore hats, all men, all women wore skirts and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that's the way we should go back, but there were just standards that everyone kind of adhered to. So we've got these societal standards that people adhere to. I'm not saying we should go back to those. All I'm saying is people were trying to be similar to one another. We are now in an age where everyone is trying to be unique and different. Lot size of one, okay? It just makes it harder for us to kind of come together, because it seems like we've got forces trying to say well, we don't want to come together. We want to be different. What are your thoughts on that? Is because we can't do what the Army can do. We can't do what the armed forces can do. It's we're going to make you all similar. What are your thoughts on that push-pull pressure?
Yeah. I'm an old guy, and so I would love to have everybody have to follow certain rules. Everybody gets up for physical training, the whole nation at a certain time in the morning, but that's not going to happen. But I think that there need to be standards. Now, I don't think there need to be everybody wear hats and the women wear skirts, because those times have changed. But I think there need to be standards of decorum. There needs to be things you say and you don't say, and that includes social media. There are things you don't write. There should be things like a gentleman doesn't do that. A lady doesn't do that. And I would, ask everybody to perform as gentlemen and ladies because that's just respectful to everybody else. Because the society doesn't work without some kinds of rules. The rule of law is nothing more than an enabler. It allows us to feel safe that the property we own and the things we do are protected by commonly accepted rules in society. And I think larger than written legal laws, there need to be social norms. And so, again, you don't want them to be so corseting that someone can't be a little different than everybody else. But you do want to have things that give us commonality. Because if we're all starkly different, it's hard to do anything together. It's hard to understand if everybody speaks a different language.
Yeah. Stan, right off the bat, you give us that great equation here, character equals conviction times discipline. And it's so great, for the work that we do, because we can say, replace the word character with the outcomes, and the conviction is what your strategy, and the discipline is the execution. There's lots of ways to modify that and help people understand. So thank you for the gift of that formula. But I wanted to ask you as we close out, your subtitle is Choices That Define a Life. Part of that says, well, what's a good life? And then part of it is this choice is really a decision.
Right.
And we're asking people to make decisions about today, about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, legacy. And those are hard because there's so much unpredictability, uncertainty about what the future holds. And that there's a lot of people, young people, live for the moment type of thing. What would you leave us with as far as discipline and convictions and decisions and good life? What would you leave us with that you would really want, especially the young people listening, to take away from this?
Yeah. Who you are is not an accident that just happens. Who you are is the result of a number of decisions you make, choices that you make, and then some circumstances that impact the outcomes of those. But generally, we have agency over who we are. We certainly have agency over our convictions, what we decide to believe in, and what we decide to live to. And we have agency over the discipline we show. So, as Admiral Stockdale taught us from the Hanoi Hilton, you may not control your physical surroundings, but you control your mind. And so what I would tell everybody is make decisions on who you want to be and then move toward that. Expect to stumble, expect to make mistakes, expect that your goal on the kind of person you want to be will evolve, and it may change somewhat significantly, but make it intentional. Everything you do, make those decisions, and the best you can, show the discipline to live to them. Over time, it will get clearer and clearer to you, the person that you want and ought to be. And you'll be awfully glad that you didn't drift around and then suddenly have an epiphany at a certain point. If you let that carry you in the right direction.
Now, Stan, thank you so much for being a guest on our show. Thank you for this book. Thank you for the kindness you've shown Jan and I through the years. So we really appreciate you being a guest on the show.
Well, completely my honor and always my pleasure. So thanks very much. And thanks for what you guys are doing. Almost 500 shows now. So that's pretty cool.
Holy cow. Yeah. Thank you. For our listeners, that's all we have for you this week. We'll include ways for you to connect with Stan in our show notes, all about his book. So make sure to visit us at theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, I think, therefore I am. René Descartes.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.